hopefully some interest in the public, and we thought it'd be a good year to do a training on the use of technology, on the process over the coming 3 evenings, as well as the city's financial structure, very high level, and then Oregon budget law and the role of the budget committee. I want this to be a conversation, so as I'm going along, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. And with that, I'm going to get going. Share my screen here. All right, everyone sees that? There we go. And with that, I think I can move on to the first slide, use of technology. For the public, we ask that members of the public keep their microphones muted until agenda item business from the audience. If you're joining us online with the tablet, smartphone, or computer and wish to speak during business from the audience, please use the raise hand option to be called upon to provide comment when the designated time is announced. To access that raise hand, I think for most of you, if you just scroll your cursor down to the bottom of the page, you'll see that raise hand function. And then public comment submitted by email and mail will also be read into the record if time allows. We've got 20 minutes set aside from business from the audience for this first evening. For the committee, please keep your microphone on mute unless you'd like to speak. To indicate to the chair your desire to speak, please use the raise your hand function. We're actually haven't started the budget committee officially, and when we do, we'll do election of the chair. So for this period, I'll be the one that's calling on raise hands. The chat should be disabled, but remember that all chat becomes part of the public record. And then all meetings of the budget committee will be recorded. For the voting mechanics, similar to last year, we're going to do a voice vote. All in favor say aye. All opposed say no when deciding on motions. In the case of a no vote, the chair will need to ask for a roll call vote in order to identify the vote count and vote ownership for the record. For the election of officers, if it's just a single nominee, we're going to use the process I described. If we have more than one nominee, we're going to do a roll call vote and ask that each voting member indicate the name of the nominee they wish to cast a vote in favor of. And interesting enough for tonight, missing Councilor Woodrow, there's 11 individuals on the budget committee. 6 would normally be a quorum for 11, but as it is required by Oregon budget law, it's got to be a quorum of all members. So we still base that quorum on 7, on the 12 members, 7 is the quorum. And so we'll need 7 positive votes to move any motion this evening. And I have a raised hand, I think, from the public, and we're actually going to wait until business from the audience for any feedback. As far as questions go for this time, we're going to limit it to the budget committee. Some other items of note. This year, we're going to elect a secretary. And while it's not a requirement for the city under Oregon budget law, it is for intergovernmental agencies. Because MWMC of the regional wastewater facility is incorporated into the city's budget, for them to be compliant with Oregon budget law, we'll need to have a secretary. It does no harm for the city, so we'll just add that to the city process. And then department directors are going to be available. They're actually attending this evening, but we haven't designated any time for actually budget questions and discussions. We have time set aside. I'll be covering the agenda here in a little bit. But when we get to that point of questions, we'll be bringing them up one at a time. Moving on to the agenda for this evening, we're starting with this budget committee orientation. We'll take a brief 10-minute intermission after that, and then we will kick off the proposed 2022 budget committee process. It's going to start with our chair from the previous year. Councilor Pictionary is going to ask for a roll call. Staff will do that. And then we'll proceed with the election of officers, starting with the chair. Once the new chair is elected, the gavel's passed, and they'll be running the meetings from that point forward. After all the officers are elected, Nancy Newton, the city manager, will be delivering her budget message, followed by my budget overview. Then we'll have business from the audience, and that will be it for this evening. Next Tuesday, May 4th, again, the chair will open the meeting and call for a roll call. And we've set aside 90 minutes for questions and discussions on the budget that evening. So with the department presentations pre-recorded, this is going to provide us a lot more time to have that conversation. And I'm definitely looking forward to it. Again, we can approach it, and we'll determine this on the evening. I can bring up one department director at a time, and we'll just run through the list of directors, or we can start it with the question for a director. And then once we bring that person up, anyone who has questions for that director can ask them, and then we'll just wait for the next question and see where that lands us with the next department. You know, with last year, I think it'll be similar this year. There's not necessarily going to be questions for every department. We'll have a brief intermission after that, and then again, we'll open it up to business from the audience, and that'll conclude evening 2. And then May 11th, we're going to start with the CETA budget process. And I'm just showing that we've set aside 60 minutes for that. It's essentially just a scaled down version of what I'm describing over the course of these 3 evenings. And that's in your agenda packet. That'll begin at 5:30. So we will kick off the city's budget committee at 6:30, again with a roll call. And then we're going to have a public hearing on state shared revenue. And then we're going to have another 30 minutes set aside for questions and discussion on the budget, followed by an intermission. And then again, business from the audience. We've allotted a little more time on the 3rd evening. And then we move into the budget deliberations and approval. And that's where I bring up the spreadsheet. We start with the proposed budget and then any motions to make any adjustments. And then after that, we have a series of motions at the end of your packet that we'll need to conclude the process. And I'll be talking again later what that process involves in future slides. And that'll be it for the fiscal year 2022 budget process. I've set aside a 4th evening if needed. Nothing is scheduled for that evening. It's only there if we flow into it. City finances. So I'm going to try not getting too deep into the weeds here, but I think there's some basic understanding that's pretty beneficial to have. And you know, everyone who's opened up this document, you know, you've got a 600-page document that is full of a lot of detail, and you haven't had a lot of training. And I think for most of you, it's just being involved in this process over the years that you start to develop that understanding. So my hope this evening is just to get you there a little faster for those of you that are new. The city uses fund accounting, and this is pretty typical for governments, and it's designed to help governments ensure and demonstrate legal compliance. A fund is a fiscal and accounting entity with a self-balancing set of accounts, which are segregated for the purpose of carrying on specific activities or attaining certain objectives in accordance with regulations, restrictions, or limitations. At its core, each fund is like its own self-balancing business entity, and we have over 30 funds, and it creates a rather complex organization. I'm going to be talking about some of those key funds and the services that we provide in those. The 2 funds we have are government funds, typically used to account for tax-supported activities, and proprietary funds or enterprise funds. These are used to account for government's business-type activities, activities that are usually supported by fees or charges. And I'll point out those funds as we get to them, so it's a little clearer. The purpose of and primary revenue sources for the city's key funds, starting with the general fund. The general fund provides public safety. When I talk about public safety, and I'll be talking about it quite a bit this evening, I'm including police, fire, and the municipal courts. The general fund also provides the library, the city's planning, facilities, and administrative services. Administrative services cover HR, finance, IT, city attorney office, and city manager's office. And the general fund is funded through property taxes, charges for services, state shared revenue, franchise fees, and internal service charges to other funds. And when I get into my later presentation, the overview, I'll go into a little more detail on some of those revenue sources to help you understand those. The street fund, this is funds the street operations, and it's funded primarily by a gas tax. And then the transient room tax fund. This funds a portion of our economic development program as it relates to tourism, the Springfield Museum, and then special event operations. And it's funded primarily through transit room tax receipts, essentially for overnight stays in the area hotels. And these are all government type funds funded from primarily taxes. Continuing with government type, we've got the Building Code Fund. That's building safety and permitting, building safety permitting and inspections, and is funded through building permit fees. We've got the two urban renewal funds, and these are property tax funded through tax increment, where we've frozen the base, and then any increase in tax increment in those districts goes specifically to those funds for development that creates additional tax increment. And I'll be talking a little bit more about those later. But they're funded primarily by property taxes. And then we have our two local option levies, one for fire, which funds a portion of 1 of 5 engine crews, and then one for police. And that actually funds our jail operations, as well as partial support of municipal police operations and the city prosecutor. And then these 3 funds are all considered enterprise type, which I spoke to are more business type funds. Our sewer and our drainage fund, they support the operations of both those activities as well as the capital projects within. And then they're funded primarily by user fees. And then our Booth Kelly Fund. And over the years, we have acquired properties for different reasons. And we've put those properties to good use. And they include our Booth Kelly facility, our Carter building, the depot, as well as some other miscellaneous properties. And these generate lease revenue. So our city accounting structure, I'm going to go a little more into the weeds here, but there's a reason behind it, and you'll see that later. Our account structure is broken into 5 segments, a fund. And when we went through those funds, I had all the fund numbers alongside of them. A department, which would be like finance, HR, city manager's office. A program, which I think as you've gone through the proposed documents, you've seen the program pages, and an account. And this is the segment that when you get into those 600,000 series, when you start getting into line item detail. But I'm going to speak to that account here in a second because we aggregate it for our purposes. And then a project code, which is actually an optional segment that we use for our capital projects. I've bolded the 3 segments that I want you to understand, and they are the fund, the department, and then with the account, they create categories. This creates our legal level. And what's going to come out of this process at the end of these 3 meetings is an attachment that's going to go with the resolution that is going to detail the legal level appropriation that you are setting. And that is the appropriation that we cannot exceed as a government. Talking about those categories in the account, starting with personal services, which are our salaries, is our 500,000 series. Materials and services are 600,000 series, and capital outlay are 700,000 series. Those 3 series, 500,000 through 700,000, form what's called operating, and that's a legal level. They're aggregated together by department, by fund, and they'll make more sense here in a moment. Capital projects is our 800,000 series. It's exactly what it sounds like. Capital projects, again, are aggregated, all 800,000 by department of fund, create a legal level. But our council has gone a step further and asked that each capital project be its own legal level. Essentially being that if for any reason we were to exceed the cost of our budgeted estimate for a capital project, that you want that to come back in front of you with an explanation. And then we have non-departmental, it's our 900,000 series. This breaks down into a number of categories that I've described below. Each of them is their own legal level. Interfund loans, interfund transfers, debt service, statutory payments, contingencies, unappropriated fund balance, and reserves. So this is what an appropriation looks like for a single fund. Remember, we have 30-some funds, so it's quite a large document. But starting at the general fund level, Fund 100, by department, and operating, again, it's all 500, 600, 700,000 accounts. The city manager's office is its own legal level. DPW is its own legal level. And what that means is each of those departments cannot exceed that amount. They cannot borrow from another department. And so if for any reason they were to exceed that, if we need to come back in front of council in the form of an appropriation transfer or a supplemental budget, and all that is basically guided through Oregon statute. That's a level of detail that I won't get into this evening. Then we have our total department operating, and then we have our non-departmental. In the case of the general fund, there's only 3 categories: transfers, contingencies, and reserves. I'm calling out reserves there because reserves and unappropriated ending fund balance are not appropriated for spending. So even though we budget for them as if they're an expenditure, they're actually locked up for future years' use. To access your reserves after you've adopted a budget, again, it has to come in front of council. There's specific rules that guide how that process works. And essentially, it has to be for something that was unforeseen at the time that you put together your budget. Moving on to Oregon local budget law. And I'm going to pause. Does anyone have any questions at this point? All right. Local budget law does 3 important things. It establishes standard procedures for preparing, presenting, and administering the budget. It requires citizen involvement in the preparation of the budget and public disclosure of the budget before its formal adoption. And it controls expenditure of public funds. I've already spoken a little bit to that control. I'm going to address the first 2 items here. First one being establishes the standard procedures for preparing, presenting, and administering. So I've kind of broken it down to 7 steps of the budget cycle. It starts with the proposed budget being prepared. And this actually, we kicked this off in October with the work session. We bring a 5-year forecast in front of council, and we talk about some of the issues that we'll be dealing with in the coming budget cycle. The budget team starts to meet and we open up the budget process to departments and start compiling the budget. And essentially it culminates in this evening as we propose to you a budget that must be balanced. So we've already put 6 months of energy into this and a lot of staff work. Budget committee meets. That's going to start this evening and then proceed over the coming 2, possibly 3 weeks. The budget committee approves and recommends a budget. And this is something I want to point out. I'm going to touch on it again at other points. This is a recommending body. It is not an adopting body. So what you are going to produce out of here is a recommendation to council for adoption. Council can still, at the point of adoption, make changes to this budget. And again, there's guidelines that guide how those changes can happen. But again, you are a recommending body. So after you've recommended this to council for adoption, the finance department has to publish a summary of that budget and publish it in the Register Guard and notice of a budget hearing. And that is scheduled right now, I believe, for June 21st. Then the budget hearing will be held and the budget adopted, appropriations made, and the tax levy declared. And then the last step is for us, after you've adopted that budget, is that we file with the county and our levy is certified. That second item, the public process. To give the public ample opportunity to participate in the budgeting process, local budget law requires that a budget committee be formed and a public process conducted to approve the budget. Essentially, what's a budget committee? The budget committee is the city's fiscal planning advisory committee. It consists of the city councilors and an equal number of citizens at large. The citizen members are appointed by city council. They serve 3-year terms. Terms are staggered to turn over by 1/3 each year. And they can serve 2 consecutive terms before being required to sit out a year. The budget committee's main role: meet publicly to deliberate on the proposed budget, provides an opportunity for the general public to comment on the proposed budget, may make adjustments to the proposed budget, approves and recommends a balanced budget to the city council for adoption. Again, it's that recommending function. Recommends the tax levies and debt service amounts, holds a public hearing and makes recommendations to the city council on the use of state revenue sharing monies, and then communicates with members of the community about the budget process, opportunity to provide input, and the constraints the city faces in financing all requested services. What the budget committee is not authorized to do. You cannot change salaries. You cannot negotiate contracts. You can't change council priorities or policies, and you cannot change the law. The rules regarding budget committee. It's open to the public. A quorum is required to approve any motion. And this kind of gets at what I addressed earlier. One more than half the total number of members, and that's based on total number of members, not members present. If no quorum exists, you may discuss business, but no formal action taken. It requires the election of a chair and a vice chair, and then we've added the secretary this year. The positions serve 1 year. The chair is expected to maintain an aura of impartiality, to run the meeting in a fair, equitable, and civil manner, ensuring members of the public are provided an open forum to speak about the budget. Minutes of each meeting must be kept. The approval of the final budget document, tax levies, and debt service amount should be in the form of a motion with the votes recorded in the minutes. Again, those motions will be in the back of your packet. And discussions of the budget committee must always take place in the form of a public meeting. So I discourage you from reaching out to each other outside the budget process to discuss this budget. A couple other things I just want to touch on. We already know it requires a budget committee. It requires the budget be developed and balanced by fund. Requires legal appropriations on some level. I've talked about that. We do fund, department, and then categories. Requires the fiscal year to be July 1st to June 30th. You know, this is a question that folks I ask all the time. Why is our fiscal year July 1st to June 30th? And that's because the state requires it. No other reason. And what's more is we have the state to thank for the fact that we are typically meeting on beautiful spring evenings. It encourages public involvement by public hearings, and it serves to control spending by limiting the changes that a city council can make. And if you want to get more information, I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg as it relates to Oregon budget law. You can get more information at the Department of Revenue website, and I've got the address there. And more information can be found in the Oregon Revised Statutes, ORS 294.305. And then finally, so I've talked about all these requirements, and then that kind of begs the question, who's following up to make sure that we've followed all of these requirements? And that's a good question. So the final step of the budget cycle is an audit of the previous fiscal year. Most local governments are subject to Oregon's local budget law and are required to have their accounts and fiscal affairs audited and examined annually. An audit must be done by an auditor certified by the Oregon State Board of Accountancy to conduct municipal audits. In addition to the financial audit of how local government handles public funds, the auditor will also look at the compliance with state laws and regulations. So I'm going to bring up another document here. There we go. So in the back of our annual financial report, and you can access on the city's website, in the very back section, there's a compliance section. In there is a report actually from our auditors. Our auditors right now are Grove, Mueller, and Swank. And essentially, it's compliance and other matters. If you look at this, we perform tests of its compliance with certain provisions of laws, regulations, contracts, and grants, including provisions of Oregon Revised Statute as specified in Oregon Administrative Rules. And I won't read any further, but you come down to the bullets, and the third one, budgets legally required, ORS Chapter 294. And then that's a whole list of items that are required to be audited by the state. And the important paragraph is this very last paragraph. In connection with our testing, nothing came to our attention that caused us to believe the city was not in substantial compliance with certain provisions of laws. And just repeats that same rule that I mentioned earlier. Yes, Holly.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing this document.
Oh, it didn't come up?
I don't think so. I'm still seeing the
Well,
annual audit.
Then I shared a screen different. Let's see, is it coming up over here? Not high.
No, I just see the budget training presentation.
Bear with me.
Thanks, Holly. I didn't see it either. I thought it was me.
Okay, how about now? No? Let me try this. Share screen. How about now? Okay, awesome. Thank you, Holly. So Again, I mentioned this is a report that's put out by our auditors, currently Grove Mueller Swank. The bullets that I was just speaking to are right here. If you look at the third bullet, budgets legally required, or as Chapter 294. And there's a whole group of other items as well. And then the last paragraph, in connection with our testing, nothing came to our attention that caused us to believe the city was not in substantial compliance. So this is how you can circle back each year to know that all the rules were followed. And to make sure I'm sharing the right thing again, I'm going to start over. There we go. Okay, we're back to the annual audit page. And current slide. Our contact info. If you cannot attend the meeting, please let myself or Neil, the budget manager, know as soon as possible. And our contact info is there. And I'll just pause for a second if any of you don't have that. And questions?
Good job.
All right. Less than 30 minutes. We can take a 10-minute intermission and we can kick off the budget committee. I'll see you all in 10 minutes.